The ice cracked beneath his paws, the freezing water swallowing him whole. His desperate yelp echoed through the silent forest. But who came to save him? No one could have expected this. The world outside was painted in the soft grays and whites of winter, the skeletal trees standing tall against the biting wind. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, settling in thick, undisturbed blankets over the frozen landscape. In a small cabin at the edge of a dense forest, Daniel Carter sat by the fire, absently running his fingers through the thick fur of his German shepherd, Rex. The dog lay sprawled across the wooden floor, his deep brown eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Rex had been with Daniel for 5 years, ever since the day he found the abandoned pup trembling beneath the wreckage of an old barn during a thunderstorm. He had been small then, nothing but skin and bones, his ears too big for his head, his ribs pressing through his matted fur. But even as a pup, there was something fierce about him, an unshakable spirit, a determination that had drawn Daniel in. Daniel, a former search and rescue officer, had spent years training dogs to find lost hikers, missing children, and accident victims buried under rubble. But after a tragic rescue mission had ended in failure, a child lost to the unforgiving elements, he had left the field, retreating to the solace of the wilderness. The guilt had been unbearable, suffocating. He had blamed himself, questioned every decision, every moment that had led to that outcome. So he walked away. But Rex had given him something to hold on to. Raising and training the dog had given Daniel a purpose when everything else had felt meaningless. Over time, their bond had become something deeper than companionship. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a friend, the only soul in the world Daniel truly trusted. The two had fallen into an unbreakable rhythm. Every morning, Daniel would wake before the sun and set out into the forest with Rex trotting at his side. The air would be crisp, the earth beneath their boots and paws damp with morning frost. Daniel had built his cabin far from the town, where the world was quiet, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant calls of wildlife. For Rex, the wilderness was a playground. He would dash ahead, his nose to the ground, ears twitching at every sound, every whisper of movement in the underbrush. He was tireless, his instincts honed from years of training, his body strong from constant movement. And Daniel? He had found peace in the isolation, in the steadiness of their routine. But something about that day felt different. The morning had been like any other. Daniel had brewed his coffee, taken a seat by the fire, and scratched behind Rex's ears while the dog lay at his feet. But Rex had been restless, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window, deep in the woods. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured, following his gaze. Rex's ears perked, his body stiffening. He let out a low whine, his tail flicking uncertainly. Daniel stood, pulling on his coat and boots. "All right, let's go see." The two stepped outside, their breath misting in the cold air. The world was eerily still, the kind of quiet that set Daniel's nerves on edge. He trusted Rex's instincts more than his own, and right now something had caught the dog's attention. As they moved through the trees, the snow crunching beneath their weight, Rex suddenly broke into a sprint. Daniel barely had time to react before the dog disappeared ahead, his powerful legs carrying him across the frozen terrain with alarming speed. "Rex!" Daniel called, quickening his pace. But the shepherd didn't slow. If anything, he ran harder. Then Daniel saw it. A frozen lake stretched out before them, its surface dusted with snow, the ice cracked in jagged, chaotic lines. And in the center, where the ice had given way, a dark, gaping hole. And Rex was running straight for it. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. "Rex, stop!" But it was too late. The shepherd's paws hit a weak patch of ice, and in an instant, the ground beneath him shattered. The world seemed to slow as Rex's body plunged into the freezing water, the surface swallowing him whole. A single desperate yelp echoed through the silent forest before being cut off. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He had lost someone once before. He would not lose Rex. For a split second, his body refused to move, paralyzed by the horror of what had just happened. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming thick clouds in the frozen air. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, like a dam breaking, instinct took over. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the ice, ignoring the way his boots slid across the slick surface. His only focus was Rex, the dog who had been his shadow, his guardian, the only living soul who had never abandoned him. "Hold on, buddy, I'm coming!" Rex's head bobbed above the water for only a moment before he disappeared beneath the surface. "No, no!" Daniel screamed. His mind raced. He knew the dangers of frozen water. The moment Rex's fur was soaked, his body temperature would plummet, muscles would seize, panic would set in. And then the cold would steal the last breath from his lungs. Daniel had seen it before, victims who had been trapped under ice, their fingers clawing at the frozen ceiling, their eyes wide with terror as the water swallowed them. Not Rex. Not today. Daniel fell to his knees, skidding across the ice. He reached the jagged hole, his fingers dipping into the frigid water as he searched blindly beneath the surface. His breath hitched. Nothing. His heart pounded against his ribs. Time was running out. With a deep inhale, Daniel did the only thing he could. He dove in. The cold was instant. It was not just a feeling, but an assault, wrapping around him like chains, stealing the air from his lungs, sinking its frozen claws into his bones. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself forward, hands reaching, searching. And then, his fingers brushed fur. Rex. Daniel grabbed hold, yanking with every ounce of strength he had left. Rex's body was limp, his eyes half-lidded, but Daniel refused to believe he was gone. With a final desperate push, he shoved both their bodies toward the surface, breaking through the icy water with a gasp. He sucked in air, his arms tightening around Rex's unmoving form. "Come on, buddy, don't do this," he choked out, dragging them toward the shore. His limbs were numb, his clothes soaked through, but he didn't care. He had him. He had Rex. But was he too late? As Daniel collapsed onto the frozen bank, clutching his best friend in his arms, a single thought burned through his frozen mind. He had saved Rex. But could he bring him back? The wind outside howled through the trees, rattling against the cabin walls like a restless spirit. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, its warmth battling the chill that clung stubbornly to Daniel's skin. But he barely noticed. His entire focus was on Rex. The shepherd lay curled in the thick blanket Daniel had wrapped around him, his body trembling violently, his fur still damp despite Daniel's frantic efforts to dry him. The shivering was a good sign. It meant Rex's body was still fighting, still trying to warm itself. But Daniel knew all too well how quickly hypothermia could turn fatal. He needed to act fast. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his legs aching with exhaustion. His own clothes were still wet, his fingers numb from the cold, but there was no time to think about himself. He rushed to the small storage chest near the fireplace, yanking it open and grabbing an extra wool blanket. He spread it over Rex, tucking it around the shepherd's body, then moved to the kitchen. His hands shook as he filled a metal pot with water, placing it over the fire to heat. He needed something warm, something to help Rex's body temperature rise from the inside. Warm broth, even just a little, might be enough to help. Every few moments, Daniel glanced over his shoulder, watching Rex's chest rise and fall in slow, shallow movements. His heart clenched at the sight of his best friend lying there, so still, so vulnerable. "Come on, buddy," Daniel murmured under his breath, rubbing his hands together to chase away the cold creeping into his own bones. "You're not done yet. You hear me?" Rex let out a weak whimper in response, barely lifting his head before resting it back down on the blanket. The sight sent a fresh wave of panic through Daniel. He wasn't used to seeing Rex like this. He was used to seeing him run through the woods, tail wagging, eyes bright with focus and determination. He was used to the dog being strong, tireless, unshakable. But now he looked fragile. and Daniel hated it. He forced himself to stay calm, even as his mind threatened to spiral. The water in the pot began to steam, small bubbles forming along the edges. Daniel quickly grabbed a can of broth from the cupboard, pouring it in and stirring it with a spoon. His movements were methodical, but inside, he was barely holding himself together. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had taken every precaution, been careful every winter when they walked near the lake. But this time, he had let his guard down, and Rex had nearly paid the price. Guilt settled heavily on Daniel's chest, suffocating him. He should have been faster. He should have seen the danger before Rex did. He should have stopped him. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was making sure Rex pulled through. When the broth was warm but not scalding, Daniel poured some into a small bowl and knelt beside Rex, gently lifting the dog's head. "Come on, buddy," he coaxed, bringing the bowl close. "Just a few sips." Rex's nose twitched slightly, as if recognizing the scent, but he made no effort to drink. His tongue barely flicked against the surface of the liquid before he let out a low whimper and turned his head away. Daniel's heart clenched. "No, come on," he urged, rubbing a hand along Rex's side, feeling the tremors still racking the shepherd's body. "You have to drink, Rex. You have to fight." But Rex only let out another soft sound, his body barely shifting beneath the blankets. Daniel closed his eyes, frustration and helplessness warring within him. He had seen this before. He had seen hypothermia take lives before. He had held people just like this, limp, shivering, weak, only to watch the cold win in the end. But he wouldn't, let it win this time. Swallowing his fear, Daniel dipped his fingers into the broth, then gently pressed them against Rex's lips, letting the warm liquid seep into his mouth. At first, Rex didn't react, but then, a flicker of movement. His tongue flicked out, tasting the broth, and a moment later, he let out the faintest, weakest lap of his tongue against Daniel's fingers. Relief crashed over Daniel like a tidal wave. "That's it, good boy," he whispered, his voice rough. "That's my boy." Slowly, carefully, he brought the bowl closer again, and this time, Rex managed a few weak licks, his throat swallowing just enough to bring warmth back into his body. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in that moment, something inside Daniel cracked. He let out a shaky breath, his forehead resting briefly against Rex's as he closed his eyes. "You scared the hell out of me, you know that," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't lose you, Rex. I can't." Rex let out a soft, barely audible sigh, as if he understood. As if he was telling Daniel he wasn't going anywhere. They stayed like that for a long time, Daniel kneeling beside his best friend, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The wind outside howled, the fire crackled, but inside the cabin, in that small, fragile moment, there was only them. And for now, that was enough. Hours passed. Daniel kept the fire burning strong, adding more logs every time the flames threatened to dim. He dried himself off as best he could, changed into warm clothes, and wrapped another thick blanket around his shoulders. Rex was still weak, but his shivering had started to subside, his body slowly, finally warming up. It was only when Daniel was certain that Rex was stable, when the shepherd let out a deep, steady sigh and curled a little closer beneath the blankets, that Daniel allowed himself to lean back against the couch, exhaustion washing over him like a tidal wave. His limbs ached. His skin still stung from the cold. His mind was raw with the terror of nearly losing Rex. But for the first time since that horrible moment at the lake, his heart didn't feel like it was being crushed. Rex was alive. And as long as he was breathing, as long as he was here, Daniel would fight for him. Because that was what they did. They fought for each other. And no matter what came next, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never let Rex go. Not now. Not ever. The fire burned steadily in the cabin, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. The warmth had begun to seep into Daniel's frozen bones, but exhaustion was making it hard to think. His body ached from the plunge into the freezing lake, and his hands still trembled from the desperate effort of dragging Rex to safety. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the German shepherd lying motionless beneath the thick layers of blankets. Rex had stopped shivering as violently, but his body was still weak, his breaths slow and shallow. Daniel kept a hand on his dog's chest, feeling the slight rise and fall beneath his palm. He needed to know Rex was still there. Each second felt like an eternity. Daniel had faced death before. He had seen it up close, had fought against it with everything he had. But nothing terrified him more than the thought of losing Rex. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Stay with me." Rex let out a low, weak sigh, his ears barely twitching. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Daniel from spiraling. He forced himself to move, grabbing another dry towel and continuing to rub the dog's fur, trying to stimulate circulation. His fingers dug gently into Rex's thick coat, pushing warmth back into his muscles. It was a slow process, painfully slow. Daniel had treated hypothermia victims before. He knew the symptoms, knew the dangers. If Rex's core temperature had dropped too low, no amount of blankets and fire would be enough. He needed more than warmth. He needed movement. Daniel hesitated. Rex was still too weak, too unresponsive. But letting him lie still for too long could be just as dangerous. "You're not quitting on me," Daniel murmured, adjusting his grip under Rex's front legs. "Come on, big guy. We need to get you moving." With a grunt of effort, he lifted Rex slightly, propping him up against his chest. The shepherd let out a soft whimper, but his body remained limp. That wasn't good. Daniel swallowed hard, the sick feeling of dread tightening in his stomach. "You have to fight, Rex," he pleaded, gently rubbing the dog's legs to get the blood flowing. "I need you to fight." Rex barely stirred. Daniel clenched his jaw, his mind racing. If he didn't do something, fast, he was going to lose him. The thought sent a fresh wave of determination surging through him. "All right," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his grip. "If you won't move, I'll move for you." With careful, deliberate movements, Daniel began massaging Rex's muscles, his hands firm but gentle as he worked along the shepherd's limbs. He applied steady pressure, trying to force warmth and circulation back into the frozen body. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Daniel kept at it, refusing to let fatigue or fear take over. He moved Rex's legs in slow, controlled motions, whispering encouragement the entire time. "You're strong," he murmured. "You're the toughest dog I know. You saved me, remember? Now it's my turn." Another whimper, slightly louder this time. Daniel's breath hitched. Rex's paw twitched. A spark of hope ignited in Daniel's chest. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice breaking with emotion. "Come on, boy. Keep going." It took another half hour of continuous effort before Rex's body finally responded. The tremors had lessened, replaced by slow, sluggish movements. His breathing steadied, his ears flicking slightly when Daniel spoke. And then, finally, he lifted his head. Daniel let out a shaky breath, pressing his forehead against Rex's. Relief flooded through him so strongly that his vision blurred. "You scared the hell out of me," he muttered. "Don't ever do that again." Rex huffed weakly in response, his nose pressing against Daniel's shoulder. A laugh, half relief, half exhaustion, escaped Daniel's lips. "You're a stubborn old mutt, you know that?" he said, running a hand down Rex's side. The shepherd let out a low, contented sigh and leaned into him. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Rex was going to make it. But the battle wasn't over yet. Hours passed. The storm outside intensified, howling through the trees, rattling against the cabin walls. Snow piled high against the windows, threatening to bury them in complete isolation. Daniel barely noticed. He had kept Rex warm, kept him moving, but now came the hardest part: waiting. Rex was stable, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His body had been through too much, his muscles too weak to do more than rest. And though Daniel knew that sleep was necessary for recovery, he couldn't shake the fear that if Rex closed his eyes for too long, he wouldn't wake up again. So he sat beside him, watching, waiting, his own body fighting off the overwhelming exhaustion. At some point, his head drooped forward, his eyes growing heavy. But just as sleep began to claim him, a sound jolted him awake, a soft whine. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Rex was stirring, his body shifting beneath the blankets. His paws twitched slightly, his ears flicking as he let out another small, tired sound. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. "Hey," he said softly, leaning closer. "You with me, buddy?" Rex blinked slowly, his deep brown eyes meeting Daniel's. There was exhaustion there, so much exhaustion, but there was something else too. Awareness, life. And then, to Daniel's utter disbelief, the shepherd's tail gave the faintest, weakest wag. Daniel let out a choked laugh, running a hand through his damp hair. "You're unbelievable," he murmured, rubbing Rex's head gently. "You really don't know how to quit, do you?" Rex huffed, a sound that was barely above a whisper but was enough to send a fresh wave of relief crashing over Daniel. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. The worst was over. Rex was going to be okay. Daniel slumped back against the couch, rubbing a hand down his face. His body ached. His mind was drained, but none of it mattered. Rex had fought, and he had won. Morning came slowly, the storm outside finally beginning to settle. When Daniel opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Rex, still lying beside the fire, still wrapped in blankets, but with more color in his face, more strength in his breathing. And when Daniel shifted to sit up, Rex followed suit. He wasn't moving fast, and he was still weak, but he was moving. Daniel grinned. "There's my boy." Rex yawned, his tongue rolling out lazily before he gave Daniel a sluggish but determined look. "You hungry?" Daniel asked. Rex's ears perked ever so slightly. Daniel chuckled, pushing himself to his feet. He grabbed another can of broth, warming it over the fire before carefully pouring some into a bowl. He brought it over, setting it down in front of Rex. For a moment, the shepherd just stared at it, his nose twitching. Then slowly, he lowered his head and took a tentative lick. Daniel exhaled, his shoulders sagging in relief. Rex was eating. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel reached out, running a hand along Rex's back, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers. The dog leaned into the touch, his tail giving another soft wag. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. The struggle had nearly broken them, but they had survived. And no matter what came next, one thing was certain. They would always fight for each other. Together. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of Rex's breathing. Daniel sat on the floor beside him, exhaustion heavy in his limbs, but his eyes never left the dog. Every slow inhale, every subtle twitch of his ears, every faint flick of his tail, it all reassured Daniel that Rex was still here, still fighting. But even as relief settled into his bones, a realization gnawed at the edges of his mind. They weren't safe yet. Rex was still weak. His movements were sluggish, his eyes half-lidded with fatigue. The broth had helped, but it wasn't enough. He needed more warmth, more food, more time to regain his strength. And Daniel wasn't sure how much time they had. Outside, the blizzard had finally begun to ease, but the aftermath was brutal. Snow had piled high against the cabin walls, covering the windows, burying the front door in an impenetrable wall of ice. They were completely isolated. If something went wrong, if Rex's condition took a turn for the worse, Daniel had no way of getting him help. He clenched his jaw, staring into the fire as he weighed his options. Staying here was risky. The supplies he had were limited, and the nearest town was miles away, completely inaccessible in this weather. He had a radio, but the storm had knocked out any chance of communication, which meant he had only one choice. He had to get Rex out of here. The thought sent a sharp pang of fear through him. The idea of moving Rex when he was still so weak, still so vulnerable, made Daniel's stomach twist. But what other option did he have? If he waited too long, Rex might not have the strength to recover, and Daniel refused, absolutely refused, to let that happen. Taking a deep breath, he turned to his best friend. "All right, buddy," he murmured, running a hand through the shepherd's thick fur. "We're getting out of here." Rex let out a soft huff, his tail twitching slightly. Daniel took that as agreement. He moved quickly, forcing his tired body into action. First, he gathered supplies, packing a small bag with food, water, and emergency gear. He grabbed a thick, insulated coat for himself and another blanket for Rex. Then came the hard part: getting out. Daniel bundled up, throwing the heavy coat over his shoulders and pulling on his thickest gloves. Then, carefully, he knelt beside Rex, wrapping the extra blanket around him. "This is going to be rough," he admitted, lifting the shepherd gently into his arms. "But I know you, Rex. You're stronger than you look." Rex let out a small, tired sound, pressing his nose into Daniel's shoulder. And just like that, Daniel felt his resolve harden. This wasn't just about survival. This was about Rex, the dog who had never once left his side, the dog who had pulled him from the darkness when he thought he'd never find his way out, the dog who had saved him more times than he could count. Now, it was Daniel's turn. With a deep breath, he adjusted his grip and stepped toward the door. The moment he cracked it open, the cold bit into his skin like a living thing, the wind howling through the trees, whipping through the clearing. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled Rex closer to his chest and stepped outside. The world was nothing but white. Snow stretched endlessly in every direction, erasing the familiar paths, burying the forest under thick, untouched drifts. The storm had transformed everything into an alien landscape, and for a brief moment, Daniel faltered. This was madness. Carrying Rex through this, with no visibility, no clear path, it was a death sentence. But then he looked down at the shepherd in his arms, at the dog who had given him everything, and the doubt disappeared. Daniel took his first step into the snow. The cold was immediate, cutting through his clothes, sinking deep into his muscles. His boots sank into the thick powder, making every movement slow, deliberate. But he kept going. The nearest town was over 10 miles away, and he was going to make it. The hours that followed were a blur of exhaustion and pain. Daniel's legs burned with every step, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The weight of Rex in his arms was crushing, his muscles screaming in protest, but he never stopped. He couldn't. The wind was relentless, stinging his exposed skin, pushing against him like an invisible force determined to drive him back. But Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only: getting Rex to safety. His pace slowed as fatigue set in. His body was beyond its limits, but he refused to stop. Then, just as he thought he might collapse, something appeared through the haze of white. A road, barely visible beneath the snow, but there. And on the horizon, blurry, distant, but unmistakable, was a cabin. Salvation. A surge of adrenaline flooded Daniel's body. "Almost there, buddy," he whispered, his voice raw. "Hold on." He pushed forward, his steps quickening despite the agony in his limbs. The cabin grew closer, the road more defined. Hope clawed its way through his exhaustion. And then, a sound. Faint at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable hum of an engine. Daniel turned his head, his heart slamming against his ribs. A truck, plowing through the snow, headlights cutting through the storm. For a moment, Daniel thought he was imagining it. But then the vehicle slowed, skidding to a stop just feet away. A man jumped out, bundled in thick winter gear, his face half hidden beneath a scarf. "Jesus Christ," he shouted over the wind. "Are you crazy walking in this?" Daniel could barely form words. His body was shaking, his vision swimming, but he had to speak. My dog, he rasped. He fell through the ice. I need to… Get in! The man cut him off, already moving toward them. Hurry! Daniel didn't need to be told twice. With the last of his strength, he climbed into the truck, cradling Rex against him as the door slammed shut. Warmth. Instant, overwhelming warmth. His body nearly collapsed from relief. The driver gunned the engine, turning the heat up as high as it would go. Nearest vet's about 5 miles out. You think he's stable? Daniel looked down at Rex, at the dog curled against his chest, still weak but alive. He let out a breath, one that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for an eternity. I think he's gonna make it, he whispered. And for the first time in hours, Daniel believed it. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but they had made it this far, together, and that was all that mattered. The truck rumbled down the snow-covered road, its tires crunching against the frozen ground. The heater blasted warm air, thawing the ice that had crept into Daniel's bones, but he barely noticed. His arms were wrapped protectively around Rex, his fingers buried in the shepherd's thick fur, feeling the faint but steady rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing. That was all that mattered. Daniel glanced up at the driver, a middle-aged man with weathered features and sharp blue eyes that flicked toward him every few seconds, concern etched into his face. Name's Tom, the man said, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they hit a patch of ice. You're lucky I found you. Another mile in that storm, and you'd be buried out there. Daniel barely registered the words. His mind was still caught in the image of Rex sinking beneath the ice, the helplessness, the desperate fight to bring him back. You all right, son? Tom asked, eyeing him. Daniel swallowed hard. I will be, he muttered, as long as he makes it. Tom nodded, his expression softening as he glanced at the dog in Daniel's arms. Looks like one hell of a fighter. Daniel let out a weak, breathless laugh. Yeah, he is. The storm outside was still relentless, snow swirling in thick waves across the road, but the truck pushed forward. Every bump and turn sent another jolt of pain through Daniel's exhausted body, but he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting Rex help. The minutes stretched endlessly, each one an agonizing eternity. But then, finally, the glow of a small roadside clinic appeared through the haze of white. Tom pulled up as close as he could to the entrance, throwing the truck into park. Go, he said gruffly. I'll handle the rest. Daniel didn't hesitate. He shoved the door open, stepping into the freezing air with Rex still cradled against him. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he forced himself forward, stumbling toward the clinic doors. The moment he stepped inside, warmth enveloped him, but he barely had time to process it before a woman in a white coat rushed toward him. Oh God, what happened? She demanded, eyes widening as she took in the sight of Rex, limp in his arms. He fell through the ice, Daniel rasped, his voice hoarse. He's hypothermic. He needs help now. The vet nodded sharply, motioning to a tech. Get him to the back, now. Daniel moved to follow, but the woman turned to him, blocking his path. You're freezing, she said firmly. Let my team take care of him. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, his legs buckled. The world tilted. Strong hands caught him before he hit the floor. Voices murmured around him, distant and hazy. Then, darkness. When Daniel woke, the first thing he felt was warmth. Soft blankets wrapped around him, a steady beeping noise filling the quiet space. His body ached, but the deep, numbing cold was gone. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then, it hit him. Rex. His eyes snapped open. He sat up too fast, the room spinning for a moment before steadying. He was in a small medical bay, an IV in his arm, dry clothes replacing his frozen, soaked ones. His head throbbed, but he didn't care. He swung his legs over the bed, yanking the IV free. A nurse rushed in. Whoa, slow down. Where is he? Daniel demanded, already pushing past her. The nurse sighed, but there was something in her expression, something gentle. He's in recovery. Come on. Daniel followed her through the hall, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, he saw him. Rex was lying on a thick padded bed, a blanket wrapped around him. An IV was hooked to his leg, a slow drip feeding warmth and fluids back into his system. His breathing was steady. His body still looked weak, but his chest rose and fell in strong, rhythmic movements. And when Daniel stepped closer, Rex's ears twitched. His eyes fluttered open. For a split second, Daniel couldn't breathe. Then, a soft whimper escaped Rex's throat, his tail thumping weakly against the bed. Daniel dropped to his knees beside him, his fingers threading through the shepherd's fur. "You scared the hell out of me," he muttered, his voice shaking. Rex let out another soft huff, pressing his nose into Daniel's palm. A lump formed in Daniel's throat, emotion crashing over him like a tidal wave. "You made it, buddy," he whispered. "You really made it." The shepherd's eyes were tired, his body still weak, but there was life in them. And for the first time in days, Daniel let himself believe that everything was going to be okay. He buried his face against Rex's fur, letting out a shaky breath. "You're my whole damn world," he admitted softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Rex didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His presence, his warmth, the steady beat of his heart against Daniel's palm. That was all the answer Daniel needed. 3 days later, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in thick, untouched snow. The roads had cleared, the sun casting a soft golden light over the frozen landscape. Daniel sat outside the clinic, Rex curled up beside him. The shepherd was still recovering, still weak, but his tail wagged lazily, his ears twitching at every distant sound. "You ready to go home?" Daniel asked, scratching behind his ears. Rex lifted his head, eyes bright with recognition. Daniel grinned. "Yeah, me too." Tom had offered them a ride back, and Daniel had accepted. He wasn't about to risk another trek through the snow. As they drove, Daniel glanced down at Rex, at the dog curled against his side, warm and safe. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something settle in his chest. Peace. He had spent so many years running, from his past, from his mistakes, from the ghosts that haunted him, but Rex had been there through it all. And now, as the cabin came into view, as the storm faded behind them, Daniel realized something. He wasn't running anymore. He was exactly where he was meant to be. And no matter what came next, he and Rex would face it. Together. As Daniel stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the fresh snow, he felt the weight of the past few days settle over him. The cold was sharp, but it no longer carried the same bite of fear. It was just another part of the world he and Rex had survived together. He turned back, reaching into the truck to help Rex down. The shepherd hesitated for only a second before stepping forward, his paws sinking into the thick snow. His movements were slow, still stiff with exhaustion, but there was something steady in the way he carried himself. Resilience. Daniel exhaled, watching as Rex lifted his head, ears twitching at the familiar surroundings. The cabin stood before them, small against the towering trees, but it was home. It had always been home. Rex took a step forward, then another, his tail wagging faintly. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, buddy, we made it." The truck's engine rumbled behind them as Tom rolled down the window, resting an arm on the door. "You sure you're good from here?" Daniel turned, nodding. "Yeah, thanks for everything." Tom gave a small grunt of approval, but there was warmth in his expression. "You take care of that dog, you hear me?" Daniel chuckled, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Always." With one last nod, Tom pulled away, his truck disappearing down the snow-covered road. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, staring out over the landscape, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The past few days had pushed him to his limits, had forced him to confront the terrifying reality of losing the one being who had never left his side. But they had made it. Rex let out a small huff and nudged Daniel's leg. Daniel looked down, grinning. "You're bossy, you know that?" Rex tilted his head, his eyes bright with that familiar spark of mischief. Daniel rolled his eyes but couldn't stop the warmth from spreading through his chest. He started toward the cabin, Rex falling into step beside him. Each step felt like a victory, each breath a gift. As they reached the porch, Daniel opened the door and let Rex step inside first. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them instantly, and as Rex curled up by the fire, Daniel took a long, steady breath. Some things had changed, some things never would. But one thing was certain: no matter what storms came, no matter how many battles they had to fight, Daniel and Rex would always find their way home. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the unbreakable bond between humans and their dogs, share it. Let others feel the love, the loyalty, the fight that never fades. Because in the end, the greatest stories are the ones we live, and the greatest companions are the ones who never leave our side.